How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Membeis, Daf 42 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, Daf 42 is major. Really, really big stuff. Big stuff. We begin the parak of Elu Treifos. This is huge. This is really, really huge. Elu Treifos, we are going, well, as the name tells us, we are going to be learning about Treifos. Okay, why is it such a big deal? Let me even say this. In the art scroll, there is a full book. I've never seen this before. A full book of the art scroll Gemara dedicated to just one parak. I've never seen that before. I might be the only time. You know, usually Masechta in the art scroll Gemaras is divided into, I don't know, anywhere between 1 and I think maybe 4 books, and you have a few prakim in each one. There is one of the books for Masechta Chullin is dedicated to Elu Treifos. We are going to be learning all about animals, as we're going to see in just a few minutes. There's going to be a lot of slides on today's daf. We are going to be learning a lot about the intricacies of animals and how they work and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, so right, the pasuk says in Parshas Mishpatim Uvasar, Basada treif lo sochelu, right? That we don't eat treif. Now, literally, what that means is that an animal attacks another animal and essentially kill. Well, if it kills it, then that's nevela. That's a different issur. Don't eat nevela, but it badly injures it. And as the Rambam points out, both in Hilchos Maicholas Asuras as well as in Hilchos Shchita, that Diber Akosov Behove, that the pasuk is talking about a kind of common occurrence of an animal out in the field that badly injures another animal, but really it applies to any situation where you have an animal that, as the end of our Mishnah today is going to say, Ze'aklal kol she'ein kamoa chaya treifa. Any situation where an animal that's alive will be unable to continue living with the injuries it has already sustained, that will be considered a treifa. We're already going to see today's Gemara that it's a machlekes whether a treifa can actually live, but that's the concept of a treifa. Essentially, an animal, the assumption is like that. That's how the Rambam paskins, and I think generally we assume that a treifa is defined as an animal that has some kind of a condition that will prevent it from living for 12 months. And we are going to be learning all about such conditions. So that's the concept of treifas. Anyways, on today's daf, we are going to be learning the source for the 18 treifas. Our Mishnah is going to the first Mishnah of Masechta, the first Mishnah of Perek Elu Treifos lists 18 types of treifas. We're going to first learn about the source for that, and then we are going to question whether there are actually more than 18 treifas. Cheve, this is what we have to look forward to today. It's going to be a great daf, a lot of visuals, a lot of stuff to look at. I've found it very interesting looking into all of these things. I feel like I can be a butcher, honestly. I almost feel like I could be a butcher. I've been reading about how the animals work and stuff, and I've watched like videos of butchering lambs and goats and cows, and I feel like I could start identifying different cuts and things like that. I could probably be a butcher after this. So we can all, the Babble on Talmud butchers. The Babble on Talmud butchers. Good enough name. Akoponim Chevre, let's jump in and let's learn Perek Elu Treifos. Alright, friends, we begin at Daf Membeis Omid Aleph, where the new Perek begins. Says the Mishnah, Elu Treifos bebehema. These are the treifas by a behema. We're going to get to birds at later on in the parak, I believe. These are the treifas for an animal. Nikuvas haveshet, if there is a hole in the veshet, in the esophagus. Now, as Tosfos points out, we're going to see in a few minutes about the heart, and of course the heart has chambers in them, the ventricles and the atriums and things like that. So when it comes to the heart, the Mishnah Dafka points out that the puncture needs to be into the holes in the heart, into the cavities in the heart, the atriums and the ventricles and stuff like that. The Mishnah does not point that out for the esophagus. It has to puncture into the kind of like through the layers of the esophagus, but that's because that's kind of more obvious, right? When it comes to the heart, which has thick muscle, so the Torah, the Mishnah has to specify that the hole needs to go in, into the cavities. But the same would nonetheless be true for the esophagus as well, that the hole would go through the layers of the esophagus. Now I have a slide over here showing the esophagus. As you can see, the esophagus has two layers to it. There's the outer red muscular, right? That's muscle, right? Yeah, I think that's muscle, right? Muscular layer, and the inner white, like I guess more of like a, is that tissue? Maybe what's tissue? Sharna, Neil, any of the doctors in the house? We need the guidance over here. Anyways, so then there's the inner layer, that white layer. So anyways, this puncture would have to be through both of those layers of the esophagus. So nekudas veshet. So if the esophagus is punctured, ufsukas hagargeres. This is something that we've seen before. Here's a slide of psukas hagargeres. That is the trachea. So as you see here, the trachea is split. So as we know, if it's split more than halfway, that would make it a treifa. Okay. Nikev krum shel moyach. Let's have a look at what that looks like. So what we are looking at here is the brains. Okay, so there's a few things going on in this photo over here. Okay, so in this photo, you can see all the way at the top of the photo, like towards the top of the photo where it says Kedera. I guess that's probably like where the brain like rests in the skull. I guess maybe the skull's been open or something. I don't know. But anyways, in like kind of like from halfway through the photo and down, that's the brains. Now, towards the bottom of the photo, everything's kind of labeled. This is from the Hillel book. Of course, Hillel gifted us a book with all of these beautiful photos. So this comes from the Hillel book. So towards the bottom, the bottommost label on the photo says moach, brain. So that's by the brains. Now the brains, as you can see, is encased in two kind of encasings, in two wrappings. If you look at the label all the way to the right, it says kruma tachton. That's the lower, thinner membrane. And then the in the middle of the photo where it says krum elyon, that's the outer, thicker membrane. So basically you have the brains, and the brains are wrapped in two membranes. The lower membrane being that kruma tachton, the lighter, the thinner, more translucent membrane, and then an outer, thicker membrane. So the puncture would have to be through the kruma tachton would have to be punctured. The thinner, more inner membrane would have to be punctured. Okay. So that's nikev krum shel mayach. Nikev halev lebeis chalalos. Let's take a look at the heart for a minute. So here is a photo of the heart. Now, yeah, you could see in here, this is a heart kind of cut in half. And of course, as we learned a long time ago for many of us, 9th grade biology or something, you have those different ventricles and atriums. The atriums are at the top, right? So if you look at the top right, that would be the right atrium, and the top left is the left atrium, and then the bottom areas of so you have on the right ventricle, and the left ventricle, and you basically have blood coming into the heart and being pumped out of the heart. Akoponim. So the heart has kind of a thick muscle, especially if you look like at the left ventricle, right? That there's a lot of muscle there on the left there, because it pumps out the blood to the whole body. And so any puncture would have to be through all of that muscle and getting in to the atria or to the ventricles. Okay. So nikiv alev lebeis chalalo nishbra shedra v'nifsak achut shela. If the spine breaks and the spinal cord breaks, let's take a look at what that looks like. So here you have a photo of the spinal cord. Now the spinal cord, of course, runs through the whole kind of back of the animal, right? The animal, I didn't have a photo of this, but I think I just assumed that we wouldn't need one. So basically going from the head of the animal through the tail, down through the tail, at the top of the animal, its whole back, there's the spine runs throughout, and in the spine, there's the spinal cord, as you see in here. If that spinal cord gets severed, so that would be, and that's the main thing, the spinal cord, right? So you could theoretically, you could break the spine, but as long as the spinal cord is intact, it's not a treif. If the spinal cord is broken, it would be considered a treif. Nitala koved, okay, if the liver is missing, none of it remains. Hareya shenikva, osha chasera, if you have a lung that has been punctured or is otherwise lacking. Rashi points out the Gemara is going to ask what's the difference between punctured and lacking. Reb Shimon Omer says, Reb Shimon acha tinokev lebeis simponos. Reb Shimon says that when we talk about a lung that is punctured, it would have to be punctured to the bronchi. Here's a photo of what that looks like. Here is a here's a photo of the lungs with all of the bronchi coming from the trachea that kind of branches out, like kind of branches into the lungs. So the puncture would have to be into the bronchi, according to Reb Shimon. Nikva keva. Okay, if the keva, the stomach, is punctured. Now, this is really just one of the stomachs. So let's take a look at this. Here I have a photo of the digestive system, in this case of a sheep, but it's the same concept for goats, the same concept for cows. So let us walk through the journey of a morsel of grass a mouthful of grass traveling through the sheep. So basically, if you look at the photo we got here, so starting with the sheep head all the way at the right, top right. Let me take a little bit of coffee over here. What time is it? It's 3 a.m. Okay. So we have this sheep. So the sheep takes a mouthful of grass. Now, so let's follow the journey through the sheep. So the sheep takes a mouthful of grass, and that grass makes its way down the veshet, the esophagus. Now, once it gets through, so from the esophagus, it goes into what's called the keres. We're looking for the keva. We're not there yet. But it goes to the keres. We're going to get to the keres. We're going to basically get to many of the things in this diagram. So basically, the mouthful of grass is going to go down the esophagus, and we'll get to the keres. The keres is the label all the way to the right. It says keres. That's kind of the biggest stomach. Now that grass is going to go into the keres. It's going to start kind of being broken down. Now after the keres, it goes to the beis hakosis. That's the label at the bottom right of the photo, is the label that says beis hakosis. The beis hakosis, I don't have a photo of it. I'm sure that we'll have photos in the future. But the beis hakosis is kind of, it literally means that the house of the cups. Basically, the inside of the beis hakosis is like, maybe I should have had a photo of it, but I don't. But it's basically like little chambers of sorts, as you can imagine, like little chambers, and the food kind of goes into the beis hakosis, and there it gets kind of formed into, I think, like little like balls or something like that. Now, of course, when it comes to kosher animals, there's essentially two requirements: split hooves and chewing its cud. Right, so kosher animals chew their cud, which means that food will then go back up the digestive system, back into the mouth of the sheep, where the sheep can enjoy it once again, and it can like chew these like balls of grass or whatever. And then the sheep will swallow it once again, and it'll go through the stomach and right through the keres, through the beis hakosis, and from there it'll go to the hemsis. The hemsis is kind of, if you follow the diagram, so we've been the keres and the beis hakosis. The next label to the left says the hemsis. That is the next stomach, the third stomach. I think in there things like start becoming, breaking down more to kind of like more like liquidy. And then from the hemsis, it goes into the keva. That's the next label to the next label all the way at the bottom of the photo, but to the left of the hemsis, it says keva. The keva is what we're talking about now. That's the fourth stomach. So after the mouthful of grass has gone through the esophagus and through the keres and through the beis hakosis and the hemsis, it finally gets to the fourth stomach, which is the keva, which, as an aside, there is a parak in Masechta Chullin called Hazra v'Alechayim v'Akeva. The keva is one of the matos kahuna. It's one of the things that are given to the priest as a gift when you slaughter an animal. Anyways, so this keva, this stomach, is what we are talking about now. But let's just for a minute, let's just continue talking about the digestion. It then, of course, travels from the keva through the reish me'aya, the beginning of the intestines. Then, if you look at the bottom left label, it says dakin. Those are the small intestines. Okay, we're going to get to there soon as well. From the small intestines, it then goes to essentially the larger intestines and then kind of out the back. Okay, so it is that keva, it's that fourth stomach that we're talking about at present. So says the Mishnah, nikva keva, if that fourth stomach, if the keva is punctured, that's a treifa. Nikva hamara, the gallbladder. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So here is a photo. This looks like a sheep or a goat that has been cut open. It's hanging by its legs at the top, and at the bottom of the photo with like the blood dripping down, that's basically where the head was chopped off. And now this is, you kind of opened up the stomach. So now, wait, well, let me see something. Okay, fine. So you kind of sliced open the stomach. Now at the bottom right of the opening where the stomach has been like opened up, you see kind of this green radioactive looking thing. That's the gallbladder. It looks kind of freaky. But that like green radioactive bit, that is the gallbladder. It's like attached to the liver. Right? It's right next to the liver over there. You can actually see a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff to see in this photo. But yeah, that gallbladder, I could have added more arrows, but anyways, that gallbladder is attached to the liver. Yeah. Anyways, you can see a lot of stuff in that photo. The liver, the kidneys, the spleen, the diaphragm. Anyways, fine. I'm sure we'll be getting into more of this stuff. Anyways, where are we? So nikva akeva, fine, nikva amara. So if the gallbladder is punctured, that is a treifa. Nikvu adakin. Okay, so going back to the digestive system, so the dakin, if you go all the way to the bottom labels, the bottom label all the way to the left is the dakin, the small intestines, which we may have already been able to recognize from 9th grade biology. But those are the small intestines. If the small intestines get punctured, hakeres apnimis shenikva. Now, wait, did we? Okay, fine. Okay, so hakeres apnimis shenikva. So also looking at this digestive system, so the label all the way to the right of the photo, the rightmost label says, right, it's kind of in the middle of the photo, all the way at the right, it says keres. That's the big stomach. That's the first stomach, the big stomach. So if that gets punctured, okay. So hakeres apnimis shenikva. O shenikra rov achitzona. So it's unclear exactly what the rov achitzona means, but one opinion of what it means is that we're going to have to come up and get this in the Gemara. So we didn't kind of see so much about this. Yeah, we haven't seen so much about it yet, but this is the one explanation that I've kind of seen. Anyways, so notice in this, so the abdominal wall, if you look at this photo, the abdominal wall, basically, if we actually go back to the previous photo of the gallbladder, this in some ways is a better photo. In some ways, the other photo is better. But so as I mentioned before, this is a photo of like, I don't know if it's a sheep or a goat. I have a feeling it's a sheep, but I want to say it's a goat. So let's say it's a sheep. So you have this sheep, and it's being hanged by it's hanging by its legs. And as you can see at the bottom of the photo, there's like blood dripping out. That's where the head was removed. And what you're looking at is the stomach was kind of cut open. Now, if we go back to the abdominal wall photo for a second, so there is a arrow pointing. Now, where that arrow is pointing to, basically, I keep on flipping. Basically, I want this photo of the abdominal wall, but with the quality of the gallbladder photo. So if we flip back to the gallbladder photo, basically where that arrow was pointing to, but in this photo, you notice that there's like meat, right? Meaning where the stomach was kind of like opened up, where the stomach was like cut through to open up. So there's essentially some like a layer of meat that was cut through. Now it's that layer of meat that we're talking about. Now if we go back to the abdominal wall photo, so where that arrow is pointing to, it's that abdominal wall, that layer of meat. Now the thing is, now the reason why I prefer this photo is because you could see the stomach kind of hanging out of there. Basically, when you start slicing open the sheep or the goat, cows are a whole different story. That's a much bigger operation. But you need like saws and stuff for that, I think. But when you start opening up the stomach, when you start slicing open the belly or whatever of the sheep or of the goat, basically the first thing to kind of pour out of there is the stomach, as you see here. But the thing is, there's a lot more organs than the stomach. There's like all the small intestines and the inner organs like the liver and all sorts of things. So basically the point is, all that meat, all that flesh on the underside of the animal, of the belly. So part of it is going to be covering the stomach, but also part of the stomach is also covered by the rib, is in like the rib cage. So the reason why it's called, what does it say? It's called Rov Achitzona. Nikra Rov Achitzona. Basically, that meat partially covers the stomach, but it was also kind of a cover for other parts of the inner organs and intestines as well. Now, fine. So basically, so if rov achitzona. So if rov achitzona, so basically the point is the part of that belly that is covering the stomach, excluding any parts of the belly that are covering intestines and other stuff like that, only the part of that belly that is covering the stomach, if the majority of that section of the belly is sliced, is slit, is torn, so then that would be a treifa. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Hagdola Tefach. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, if we're talking about a really big animal where that section might be large, well then if there is a tef, if the tear is the size of a tefach, even if it might not be the majority of the section, that would be sufficient to be a treifa. V'aktana beruba, and if it's a small animal, even if it's not a tefach, but it's a majority of that section, that would be enough to make it a treifa. Hemsis uveis akosis shenikvu lachutz. Okay, let me take a shtickle of coffee, and we'll go weiter. So now going back to the digestive tract. So, right, as we saw, the sheep takes a bite of grass. It goes down the veshet, through the keres, through the beis hakosis. We're now at the hemsis, the third stomach. And then the beis hakosis and hemsis. I'm sorry. So the animal, the sheep takes a bite of grass. It goes down the veshet, the esophagus, into the keres, and from there, from the keres, which is the big first stomach, from there it goes to the beis hakosis. And from the beis hakosis into the hemsis. Now, if the beis hakosis gets punctured, but listen to what it says though. It says, hemsis ubeis hakosis shenikvu lachutz. Okay? That if the puncture is from the outside, so if there's a puncture in the beis hakosis from the outside going in, same thing for the hemsis from the outside going in, to the exclusion of if the hole is internal between the two stomachs. So meaning, imagine you have, let's say you have like a tiny little house, and in the house there are two rooms, and the two rooms are divided by a wall, and you kind of punch through that wall, so there will be a hole between the two rooms, but that hole will be entirely internal. It won't be open to the outside world. It will entirely be internal inside the house. So here also, when it comes to the beis hakosis and the hemsis, if there's some kind of a hole going between the two stomachs, it will be entirely an internal hole. That is not what we're talking about. That is not a treifa. But if there is a hole from the outside into either the beis hakosis or into the hemsis, that would be a treifa. Okay. So hemsis beis hakosis shnikvu lachutz, fine. Now, nafla min agag, if you have an animal that falls off of a roof. So if an animal falls off a roof and you then immediately slaughter it, that would actually be considered a treifa. You have to wait at least 24 hours to see if it's going to survive, because you can't just say that, well, it fell off the roof, let me slaughter it, and I'll have a look. Well, after I slaughter it, I'll look around, make sure everything looks good, and if I don't notice any treifas, so it should be okay. No, there's something that's called nisrak evarel, I believe. What does Rashi say? Right, shenisraskru v'nisparku evarel. That, right, there's something called the limbs can kind of get like, I don't know, shocked or something. I don't know. But basically, if the animal falls off a roof, we have to be concerned that even if there's nothing externally noticeable, either externally from the animal or even if you cut it open and look around, but having fallen off a roof, it could be that it will die from the fall. So you have to at least wait 24 hours to ensure that there was nothing fatal that happened. And after 24 hours, you can shecht it. But if an animal falls off the roof and you immediately shecht it, we have to assume that it is a treifa. If most of its ribs broke, so let's have a look at the ribs. So here is a photo of all the ribs of an animal. So those are just the bones there. If most of those bones broke, it would be a treifa. Okay, fine. Vidrusa sazaev, if a wolf attacks, like if a wolf attacks an animal, so that would be a treifa. That's like the most literal translation of ubasar basada treifa lo sochelu. Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, drusa sazev bedaka, a wolf could really only meaningfully injure a animal like a sheep or a goat, but it won't be able to meaningfully enough attack a cow. Now, that also depends on the size of the wolf and where they are. I was reading somewhere yesterday that, for example, like a wolf in like Yosemite National Park or so, those I think are, America does things big. So those are big wolves. I think that they might be able to attack larger prey. But the wolves in Israel, I think, are kind of like big dog kind of things, I think. But Drusas Ari Bigasa, and says Rabbi Yehuda that a lion, though, would be able to cause meaningful injury to a cow or something, and certainly a sheep or something. Drusas anates ba'of. So a nates, I think, is like some kind of like a smaller hawk. So that would be able to meaningfully injure a smaller bird, like a turtle dove of sorts. Hadak, ba'of hadak, a smaller bird. Vidrusas agas ba'of agas, and like a bigger hawk or maybe like an eagle or something, for a larger bird, for example, like a goose or something. Ze'aklal, and the Mishnah concludes that this is the rule, kol she'ein kamoa chaya treifa, that if we're talking, so this Mishnah was be'etzim talking about after shchita. If you shecht it and you find the hole here, a hole there, or the liver's missing, or the bones are broken, whatever it is. But any scenario where if the animal was still alive, it would not be able to survive for very long. So that is essentially what a treifa, that would be considered a treifa. Wow. Okay, friends, that was the first Mishnah of Elu Treifos. This first Mishnah is essentially going to last us for the next almost 2 weeks or so. But sheesh, wow, that was a real deep dive into Elu Treifos. So now says the Gemara, Amr Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Remez the Treifa minatora mi 9. Where do we have a reference to treifas in the Torah? Minayin. What do you mean? Where do we? Minayin basu basada treifa l'sochelu. The pasuk Pashut says, "Don't eat treif." Ubasu basada treifa l'sochelu. Meat in the field that is treif, that is torn up, that is badly injured. Don't eat it. Elrem is the treifa she'ena chaya minatora minayin. No. How do we know? Where do we see the Torah references that a treifa won't live? Dikatani seifa, well, right, meaning dikatani seifa, because after all, we say at the end of the Mishnah, ze'aklal, this is the rule, kol she'in kamo chaya treifa, that any scenario where if the animal was alive, it would be unable to continue being alive for much longer, right? It would be unable to live sustainably for much longer due to its injuries or due to its state of its health. So if we'd be unable to live, so it's a treifa. Michlal de treifa and a chaya, which means therefore that we're essentially defining a treifa as an animal that will be unable to live for very long. Minolan, how do we know that? How do we know that that's the definition of a treifa, that it won't be able to live? Tichsib, because the pasuk says v'zos achaya asher tochelu. I'll tell you why. Because the pasuk says v'zos achaya asher tochelu, that animals that are going to live, right? Chaya echol, animals that are going to live, you can eat them. Animals that are going to live, you can eat them. Now the pasuk says ubasa basada treifa lo sochelu, but about treifas it says don't eat them. Well, if it can live, you can eat it. So memela treifa can't live. So she'ena chaya lo seichel, animals that won't live don't eat. Michlal de treifa lo chaya, so memela a treifa will not eat, will not live, and because a treifa will not live, don't eat it. Ulmadam a treifa chaya minolan. Okay, but now not everybody agrees with that sentiment. The Tana of our Mishnah seems to be in the of the opinion that treifas won't live. However, it's a machlekes. This I don't believe is the main machlekes. Thing comes up later on, but there is a machlekes about if that's really the case. The other side of the machlekes is that treifas can live. Treifas can live for a meaningful amount of time. So if a treifa can live for a meaningful amount of time, so then how do we know that you can't eat them? We can't learn it out from that, well, certainly not the way that we learned it just now, that anything that's alive, anything that's going to live, you can eat, because according to this opinion, treifas are going to live, which would mean that you'd be able to eat it. So then how do we know to exclude treifas? So mandama treifa chaya minalan, how do you know that you can't eat treifas? So nafkale mizos achaya asher tochlu. Well, they also learn it out from the pasuk of zos achaya asher tochlu, but they learn it out a little bit differently. Zos achaya echol chaya acheres lo seichel. So whereas we learned out earlier that basically we learned out a few minutes ago that basically zos achaya asher tochlu means you can eat all animals that are going to live, and if memela treifas won't live. According to this view that treifas will live, they learn out the pasuk slightly differently, which is zos achaya asher tochlu. These are the animals that you can eat, and the pasuk then continues to say split hooves, chewing its cud, but it says zos. These, it's a limitation that even within animals that will live, there are certain animals that will live that you can eat, but there are certain animals that live that you cannot eat. There are certain animals that are chayas that will be able to live sustainably that you can eat, but there are others, treifas, that you can't eat. Michlad the treifa chaya, meaning that a treifa will live, but you can't eat it. Ve'idach haizos ma'ovidle. Now, according to the first opinion that treifas don't live, well, then what is their response, right? Because, well, what if should we call them? How do we reference these two? Instead of, it's a mouthful to say the opinion that says that treifas will live, the opinion that says that treifas won't live. Well, what if we just label them as opinion 1 and opinion 2? Treif opinion number 1 and treif opinion number 2. Treif opinion number 1 is that treifas can't live. That's kind of the prevailing opinion. That's why it's opinion number 1. It also is referenced first in our Mishnah, in our Gemara. And treif opinion number 2 is that treifas will live. So according to treif opinion number 1, that treifas won't live. So what do they do with zos, right? Because according to treif opinion number 2, they say that it's saying that it's limiting the animals that will live, right? Among the animals that will live, certain you can eat and certain ones you can't eat. But treifas are going to live, you just can't eat them. And that's enough from zos, which is exclusionary, it's limiting. According to treif opinion number 1, so what does he do with zos? My overlay. So the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, it's needed for the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, Zos achaya asher tochlu. That when it says Zos, this is the chaya that you can eat. Melamed, it teaches Shetofas HaKadosh Baruch Hu mikol min v'min, that the Rabbanu Shalom took each and every type of animal and type of treifa, v'herelo Moshe, and showed Moshe Rabbeinu, v'amrlo, and he says to Moshe Rabbeinu, v'amrlo zos echol v'zos lo seichol. No, actually, I think this doesn't necessarily have to do with treifas, but meaning, right? But this is a pasuk that is at the beginning, right? This is in Parashas Shmini, at the very beginning of the section where the Torah talks about all the animals you can eat and can't eat. So it would say, when the pasuk says Zos achaya shetochlu, so again, Melamed, it teaches Shetofas HaKadosh Baruch Hu mikol min v'min. The Rabbanu Shalom took each and every type of animal, v'herelo Moshe, and he shows Moshe Rabbeinu v'amarlo, and he says to him, Zos echol v'zos lo seichol. Eat this animal, don't eat that animal. So according to Treif, opinion number 1, that's what they learn out from Zos achaya asher tochlu, that the Rabbanu Shalom showed Moshe Rabbeinu all of the different types of animals, which you can eat, which you can't eat. But Treif opinion number 1 still maintains that treifas won't live. Ve'idach nami mibayle lichtatana devei Rabbi Shmuel. Now, according to Treif opinion number 2, who says that treifas will live, so does he disagree with the Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel about the Rabbanu Shalom showing Moshe Rabbeinu all the different types of animals? So enochinami, yeah, you're right, he does. So the treifa chaya minole. So then how do we know that treifas live? You can't eat them, but they will live. So nafkale meidoch Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel. Yitaka learns it out from a different Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel. The Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel, ben achaya ne'acheles uben achaya asher lo se'ochel. That when the pasuk says at the end of that section in Parashas Shmini, right, the pasuk says lahavdil ben atomei uben ator uben achaya ne'acheles uben achaya asher lo se'ochel elu shmone esrei treifos shenemu l'Moshe misinai tzalachel Moshe misinai. The Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel says that these are the 18 treifos that the Rabbanu Shalom showed Moshe Rabbeinu, that were said to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. So the 18 treifos are taka halacha l'Moshe misinai. Okay, givaldik. So we've seen a machlokes about whether treifas can live or can't live, and how each of them respectively learn their opinion, and ultimately resulting with this Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel that 18 treifas were said to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai. And now we get up to the next section of today's daf, exploring additional treifas. So says the Gemara, V'suleka v'aika. Why? So meaning we just said for the Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel that's halacha Moshe misinai, that the Rabbanu Shalom told Moshe Rabbeinu about 18 treifas. So there are only 18. I could tell you more than 18. Our Mishnah listed 18, but V'aika Basgar is an acronym. Beis Samach Gimel Reish. We're going to see in just a few moments what that acronym stands for, but it's basically an acronym of 4 different Mishnahs and Brises where we see additional treifas. V'shev Shmaitza, and 7 scenarios of not from Brises and Mishnais, but from Amoraim that are also a different additional treifas. So between the Basgar and the Shev Shmaitza, we have an additional 11 treifas, which would be 29 treifas. So why are we saying there are only 18? Bishlam the Tana Didan. Okay, so I can understand according to our Tana, Tana. So the Mishnah listed 18 treifas. So whatever was listed, givaldik. V'deshayir, and whatever wasn't listed from the Basgar and the Shev Shmaitza, Asya b'zeh klal. Of course, at the end of the Mishnah, it said, Zeh klal kol she'ein kamoa chaya treifa. This general rule, what's the point of a general rule? The point of a general rule is to be able to apply it to any other scenarios that will emerge. That the general rule is, if it won't live, it's a treifa. So the Mishnah listed 18 treifas, but it also listed a general rule, and the Basgar and the Shev Shmaitza can be learned out from the general rule. Ela the Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel, but according to the Tana devei Rabbi Shmuel, the Omar Yurches treifas v'su leka, But according to Talmud Yishmael, who specifically says that the Rabbanu Shalom told Moshe Rabbeinu about chai treifos, about 18 treifos, so there's no room for these additional ones. So what do we do? So what do we do? Is it 18? Is it 29? What do we do over here? So V'suleka Vayika, what about Basgar and Sheshmait? So now we're going to go through Basgar. Beis Samech Gimel Reish. The Beis is Behema Shenechtechu Raglea Min Arkuba Ulamayla Treifa. So let's take a look at another slide. And in this slide, we're basically labeling the back leg of a cow. So the back leg of a cow, so where the gold arrow is pointing to, that is the femur, that's the yerech, right? Basically a cow's leg has like 3 sections, as pointed to by the 3 arrows in the photo. So the golden arrow is pointing to the top bone, that's the femur of the cow. The pink arrow is pointing to the middle section, which is the tibia, that's called the shok in Hebrew. And then there is the bottom section that the blue arrow is pointing to, and that's more of like, I think it's the equivalent of like the ankle or something like that. But that's the bottommost section. So now, Rashi says that this is talking about the joint between the red arrow and the gold arrow. The joint between the shok and the yarich, between the tibia and the femur. So now, back in the Gemara, what about Behema Shenechtechu Ragleo that a animal that its leg was cut from this joint between the femur. It's a little bit unclear exactly what Rashi is saying, but let's just go with between the femur and the tibia. If the leg was cut there, I think the point is going to bleed to death, and therefore it is a treifa. So isn't that another example of a treifa? So answers the Gemara, Savalak Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Well, the Tana Dever Bishmal holds, like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, the Omar, Yichol lehi lichavos v'lechyos, you could stop the bleeding, and then it will live. But one second. The Gemara says, wait, who nobody said anything about living or not. Remember, according to Treif opinion number 1, a treifa can't live. But this is the Tana Dever Bishmal. This was brought up in explaining Treif opinion number 2, that treifas can live. Right? And the Tana Dever Bishmal himself learns off in the pasuk of Ben achaya anechelus uben achaya shelo siacha. Chaya, treifas live, according to the Tana Dever Bishmal. So why is this a valid answer that, well, the Tana Dever Bishmal holds like Reb Shimon ben Elazar that you could stop the bleeding and the animal will live. Just because it will live, that has nothing to do with being a treifa or not. Treifas also live. So you could stop the bleeding and it will live, and it could still be a 19th treifa. So again, so it says the Gemara, Savaluk Reb Shimon ben Elazar, the Tana Dever Bishmal, who says 18 treifas, he holds, like Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Damar Yuchol lehi lichavos v'lechyos, you could stop the bleeding, and the animal will continue to live. So said the Gemara, so what? Avagad Yuchol lichavos v'lechyos, I don't care that you could stop the bleeding and the animal will live. Leman Ka'omar, who are we asking about? The Tana Dever Bishmal, according to the Tana Dever Bishmal, that they said Chai Treifos, 18 Treifos. Tana Dever Bishmal, Treifa Chayas Virle. According to Tana Dever Bishmal, Treifas can live. So the fact that you could stop the bleeding and it will live does not preclude it from being a treifa. It could still be a treifa, and it could still be also to eat. So Chayas Virle. So Ella, Sovlik of Shimon Elazar Damak Shera. So says the Gemara, well, okay, you're right. We didn't give enough info. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar also says that in this scenario, not just can you stop the bleeding and it will live, but it's kshera. So if it's kshera, memela, it's not a treifa. So Tana's Rabbi Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that an animal whose leg has been cut at that upper joint is nonetheless a kshera. It is not a treifa. Fine. Let me have a sugar coffee. Givaldik. Continues the Gemara. V'ra'ika. But what about the following scenario? Chisaron shebeshedra. What about the scenario where an animal is missing vertebrae? The Tanam, we learned in a Mishnah Masechta Oyalos. This Mishnah is a reference to Tumas HaOil. that be'etzem, if you have a dead body in a house, so then everything in the house is tamei tumas ha'oil. Now, it could be an entire dead body, but even certain subsects, certain sections of the body can also be matami ba'oil. If you just have like a random bone, just a random bone, no meat on it, just a random bone, it will not be matami ba'oil. But if you have a whole spine, right, shedra v'gulgolis, if you have a whole spine or a whole skull, those are examples of things that could be matami ba'oil. So if you have a whole spine of a mace in the house, even if there's no meat on it or anything, it will be matami ba'oil. But if it's missing some vertebrae, it won't be matami ba'oil. So now, so how much of the spine, how many vertebrae need to be missing so that there will not be tumas ha'oil? So Beishami says if it's missing 2 vertebrae. Beisil says even if it's missing just 1 vertebrae, it will not be matami ba'oil. Ba'omer Reb Yehuda Amar Shmuel v'chein the Treif says Reb Yehuda Amar Shmuel that the same applies for Treif as well. That if a vertebrae is missing, Beisil would say that it is a Treif. No. So here we have another example of a Treif. If it's missing a vertebrae, what about that? So says the Gemara, okay, good point, fair question. Hemsis uvesakosis. If you remember in the Mishnah, we had discussed if the hemsis, which is the 3rd stomach, has a hole in it, or the beisakosis, the 2nd stomach, has a hole in it. You could do, as my grandfather would say, a moija. You could merge them together into one example of a treifa, right? A puncture in the 2nd stomach, a puncture in the 3rd stomach. You could merge those together into one, consolidate them, which frees up one of the chai treifas and swap it, move in as the 18th. If it's missing a vertebrae, that'll be the 18th. So emsis uvesakosis the kochashavta lubetaite that we in the Mishnah we listed the hemsis, a puncture in the hemsis, a puncture in the beisakosis separately. Chashvinu b'chada, consolidate them to one. Apik chada, which frees up one of the 18. Va'ayol chada, and insert the missing vertebrae. Ve'ika gluta. What about gluta? Gluta is if literally all the hide, all the skin of the animal is missing. That sounds absolutely horrible. But if the skin of the animal is missing, that could happen because maybe it gets boils all over its body, or maybe somehow through the work it's doing, its skin is gone. Oh, that's horrible. So that's a treifa. I can imagine. Oh, yivavoy. So the Reb Meir de Machshir. Well, Tanit Reb Shmuel holds like Reb Meir, who says that is taka kosher. That is taka kosher. It's not a treifa, so not included in the list. Don't worry about it. Vayika charusa. What about an animal whose lungs are all shriveled up? It can get shriveled up by like being scared or something. That it can get its lungs shriveled up, and it's a treifa. Well, says the Gemara, okay, fine. So the question is, isn't that a 19th treifa? So here's the thing: Mara man katonila. If you remember in the Mishnah, we talked about the gallbladder. That was that radioactive looking organ inside of the body. So whose opinion is it that if the gallbladder gets punctured, it's a treifa? Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda, it's a das yochid. It's the opinion of Rabbi Yosef bar Yehuda. So the Tanit of Rabbi Shmuel doesn't include a punctured gallbladder as one of the 18. So Apik Mara, remove gallbladder from the list, Ba'ayil Charusa, and replace it with the shriveled lungs. Okay, so we asked about Basgar, about these 4 scenarios. 2 of them were irrelevant, right? The broken leg, he held like Reb Shimon ben Elazar. And when it came, right, so by the cut off leg, he held like Reb Shimon ben Elazar that it was a non-issue, it's not actually a treifa. And also when it came to the missing skin, he held like Reb Meir that it's not a treifa, so that was a non-issue. And in terms of the missing vertebrae and the shriveled lungs, So we managed to free up space in the chai treifos for them. So we still managed to preserve chai treifos, 18 treifos. So the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel said that there are 18 treifos halacha Moshe Misinai. So in terms of basgar, we managed to address them while still maintaining the number of 18. But what about the following 7 scenarios that will be described by the following Amoraim? The Amor of Masna says of Masna, I buka de atma. Right, going back to the legs of the animal. So the legs of the animal, the femur, at the top of the femur, which is the topmost bone, where it's connected to the hip bone, it's like a ball in a socket, and it's called the buka de atma. Buka is like buchna. Buchna is a pestle. It's like a pestle that pounds and fits right into a mortar. So also the buka de atma. The buka de atma is basically the femur where it joins into the hip bone. The shaf miduchte that gets dislocated treifa, the animal becomes a treifa. Rashi points out that also that the sinews in there also would have to become disconnected. But that's another example of a treifa. V'amar Rachish bar Papa. Additionally, number 2, Rachish bar Papa says Mishmei derav Laksa b'chulya achas treifa. If there's some kind of a disease in the kidney, if one of the kidneys gets diseased, so then that could be a treifa. Additionally, Vitnam we learn in a Mishnah on Daf Nundalid, Nital atchol kshera. If the spleen is missing, it is not a treifa; it's kosher. But V'amar Avira Mishmei derava lo shanu ela nital. That's only if the spleen is entirely missing. Avol nikev treifa. But if the spleen is there but punctured, it is a treifa. Additionally, V'amar Rabbi Bachana Shmuel Simonim Shenidaldulu beruban treifa. It's a little bit unclear exactly what these means. I think Rashi is saying the simonim, the esophagus, the trachea, if they are mostly disconnected, I think from where they're connected to the jaw, so it would be a treifa. Tosfos, and I think the Agos Maimonios on the Rambam also explained the Rambam as saying that, so Tosfos quotes the Rabbeinu Chananel. Where are we? So okay, so that the trachea and the esophagus got disconnected, got separated one from another. Okay, that would also be a treifa. V'amar Rabbi bar Shila, Amar Rav Masna, Amar Shmuel, Nekra Tzela me ikara treifa. If one of the rib, let's actually take a look at this. Right, the ribs. Here's a look at the ribs once again. So if one of those, so you have the ribs, and the ribs are connected to the vertebrae at the top. Now those vertebrae, I believe, are made up of a few pieces. So you can, for example, the vertebrae can, there's like the right side of the vertebrae and the left side of the vertebrae. I believe that those are separate bones. So if one of the ribs gets dislocated and takes with it, and dislocated along with it is like it's half of the vertebrae, right, where it's connected to the vertebrae as well. If that gets disconnected, it will be a treifa. V'gulgolis she'nech b'saberuba. If most of the skull gets crushed, even if nothing, there's no internal damage or anything, but if everything's still there, but most of the skull gets crushed. Ubasa achofet esrova keres berubo. And this was like we described earlier in the Mishnah, right? So the Mishnah had mentioned earlier, there was the scenario of rova chitzona, shenikra rova chitzona. If you remember, we talked about cutting open the belly and the part of the under part of the animal, the part of the belly, part of it covers the stomach, and that also covers kind of all the other internal organs. So this is describing, right, as rova keres berubo treifa, right? Basically the same thing that we described earlier in the Mishnah. So we would have to say that according to Shmuel, he disagrees with, right? He would say that the Mishnah is talking about something else. Right? As I mentioned, the Mishnah, it's a machlokes about what it's talking about. So we describe the Mishnah as talking about this, but apparently there could be something else which we haven't gotten to yet that it could be talking about as well. Anyways, so that was the belly, the part, if the majority of the part of the belly that's covering the stomach, that would be a treifa. No, so that's the shev shmaitza. We just listed another 7 examples of treifas. So how are we going to fit those additional 7 into the chai treifas? And for the Gemara, nakuve tmanya havu. Well, and as we're going to learn tomorrow we're going to learn that there are 8 categories of treifas, and there is a acronym, I think it's called. It's Don Chonak Nofesh. Don Chonak Nofesh. That is the acronym. I think it's called an acronym for the 8. Right, Daled, for example, is Drusa. Nun, there are 3 nuns in there, but Nekuva, for example, right? So says the Gemara, Nekuve, that in the Chai Treifis, Tman Yabu, there are 8 examples, so meaning there are all 18 of these Treifis fit into 8 categories. So in the Mishnah, there are 8 examples of punctured things, like the punctured esophagus, punctured heart, punctured lungs, etc. So there are 8 examples of punctures in the Mishnah. We can consolidate those into a punctures category. So chashvinu b'chad, consolidate them into 1, and now if you have 8 consolidated into 1, that frees up 7. So apik shev, we free up 7 treifas, va'ayil shev, and move in the shev shmaitza, these 7 treifas. Wait, if that's the case, that we're consolidating all punctures, Pasuke nami trehavu. There were also 2 examples of things that got disconnected, right? Of things that got severed. We talked about the trachea getting severed more than halfway. We talked about the spine getting severed with the spinal column. So Pasuke nami trehavu. Chashvinu b'chad, consolidate them into 1. Batzelu chad, which frees up another of the chai treifas. Now we're actually down to 17 now. More so, now in the Shev Shmaitza, we had one example that if the spleen is missing, it's kosher, but if it's there but it's punctured, it's a treifa. Well, then that should be consolidated with the rest of the punctures as well, which frees up another one of it. So now we're down from 18. Now, initially we were saying, how are we going to fit all of the treifas into 18? Now we actually we've managed to consolidate into 16. Now we have 2 extras. So Ella Hanach Tarte de Afgas Lo Sufik. Earlier we had mentioned in the Basgar, the first and third of the Basgar, the Beis was a behema. If it's missing, if its leg is severed between the femur and the tibia, we said that's a treif. We say, oh no, but the Tanit of Rabbi Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar that it isn't actually a treifa. You don't have to say that. You can hold like the Chacham that it actually is a treifa. That's the 17th treifa. And also we had the scenario of when this gluta, when the skin is missing, we said, oh no, but he holds like Reb Meir, it isn't actually a treifa. No, he holds like the Chacham, it is a treifa, and that's the 18th treifa. Friends, that was Daf Mem Beis of Masechta Chullin. Wow, friends, Daf Mem Beis of Masechta Chullin. That's like, I feel like that's like a one for the. I feel like we're going to remember this daf. What do you call that? That's like a daf to remember or something. I mean, the first daf of Elu Treifas, we did a deep dive into mamish, into all the animals, different treifas, understanding already different parts of the animal. I'm sure we're only going to dive deeper over the next. This is a big parak. It's going to be about a month that we're going to be in Elu Treifas, understanding the inner workings of animals and birds and stuff. Anyways, the first part of the daf really was understanding the chai treifis, 18 examples of treifis in our Mishnah. Then the Gemara discussed the source for the 18 treifis, which brought up the machlekes about, we had treif opinion number 1 and treif opinion number 2. Is it like our Mishnah defines, and like the Rambam says, that a treifa eina chaya, that the definition of a treifa is that it can't live? And according to that opinion, that was learned out from the pasuk that says, "V'zos achaya asher tochlu." Only eat animals that are going to live. Animals that are not going to live, you can't eat. Treifas, that's why treifas you can't eat, because they're not going to live. However, there was the other opinion that says that treifas can live. So then, how does that opinion learn out that you're not allowed to eat treifas even though they can live? Salach l'Moshe Sinai, that the Rabban Shalom told Moshe Rabbeinu about chai treifos, about 18 treifos that you're not allowed to eat. And it was at that point we said, wait, okay, great, but you just said that there are 18 treifos. I can give you another 11 examples of treifos. And that was Membez and Membez discussing how to make, according to the Talmud Bishmo says there are dafka 18 treifos. How could all these additional treifos fit into the 18? And we did manage basof to fit them into the 18 treifos. Chevre, that was Daf Membez and Masechet Chullin. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you enjoy your day.